What's the deal with Paraguay? Oh god. I suppose some context is probably in order, so to avoid going off on any extended tangents, I'm giving myself exactly 30 seconds to explain the pre-1800s history of Paraguay. And go.
Legalize nuclear bombs.
Bonjour.
Legalize.
France.
And time. Wait. Oh, no, wait. No. Glad that's all cleared up. Let's move on. So at this point, Paraguay's gained independence, won an unlikely victory against the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, and is now a state under the autocratic rule of dictator and Paraguayan national hero,
José Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia.
More on this guy later. Okay, so I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of got completely sidetracked at this point, and this video is about to go off the rails, tumble over the precipice of relevancy, fall down the cliff of off topics, and crash land in a heap in the valley of tangents. So if you just care about funny dead people number, skip to the timestamp on screen. For the rest of you who are happy to stick around, firstly, thank you. And now let's get on with it. Okay, so the next few decades of Paraguay were tension-laden, as while they look like this, the two major next-door neighbours were eyeing up some of their juicy territory. By this point, Brazil, and whatever you want to call this state down here, we're just going to go with Argentina, had already come to blows in the Cisplatin War, which ended up with one fewer Brazilian state, and one more Uruguay as a buffer between the nations. I swear this is relevant. Yet going into the 1850s, things around Paraguay began to cool as neither side could really tussle with the landlocked state without upsetting the balance of power. Additionally, there was little appetite for war domestically due to political turmoil. Oh, and did I mention Paraguay maintained a big fuck-off army, well beyond the size one would expect, and what some would suggest was also beyond its means. So in 1844, Brazil recognises Paraguayan statehood, and Argentina follows in 1852, which also involves a key deal for the navigation of these rivers, because in Paraguay, it's all about the rivers. Oh hey, what's up in Uruguay? Oh. Well, shit. So Uruguay is a total mess, in a state of on-and-off conflict from 1832 to 1904. Here's some screenshots from Wikipedia, because I can't be asked, and this bit's not actually that important. What is key is that on one side you've got the Blancos, who are conservative and supported by bits of Argentina, and on the other side of the Colorados, who are liberal and are supported by Brazil because they're more sympathetic to Brazilian commerce and settlement, the bit of Argentina, who wins an 1861 civil war, long story, and largely Europe. Why? Well, when talking about liberals versus conservatives here, it's not in the context of the libtards versus fascist Twitter debate, but more of a whole free trade versus protectionism thing. And if Europe likes one thing at this point, it's free trade with less developed nations. Anyways, in 1860, a conservative Blanco government is elected in Uruguay and begins beefing with Brazil on taxes and trade, prompting the Brazilian Empire to throw its hat in with Argentina in supporting a liberal Colorado's coup. This goes off in 1863, leading the Blancos to call on the isolationist and protectionist Paraguay to aid them. Seeing a threat to the balance of power in the region that had previously diplomatically protected Paraguay, Francisco Solano Lopez, the nation's dictator, began to mobilize in 1864. And after no diplomatic solution could be found, Asuncion issued an ultimatum to Rio on August 30th, 1864, urging against direct involvement in Uruguay. Yet, on October 16th, Brazilian troops crossed the Uruguayan border, leading to a declaration of war on the 12th of November when Paraguayan Marines stormed a Brazilian steamship, leaving Asuncion. This official declaration came a month later, on December 13th. Just one issue. Paraguay's here, and the conflict's over here. So what do? Well, if you're Lopez, you go up to Argentina and say, hey, do you mind if we violate your sovereignty and territorial integrity to march our troops across your land to go do battle with your ideological allies? The fuck you mean no? And so, on the 18th of March, 1865, Paraguay declared war on Argentina, and with Montevideo falling a month earlier, and the consequent regime change in Uruguay, they switched sides, and two were getting involved against Paraguay. The War of the Triple Alliance had begun, and for Paraguay, this has just turned from an FPS into a survival horror. Or at least that's what they want you to believe. Did you know there was actually a grand conspiracy to topple the Paraguayan government? The small South American nation was actually employing a unique, advanced societal structure. Yes, led by a benevolent, utopian dictator, the small nation managed to industrialize and develop without help from the outside. Indeed, managed to reach a state of near autarky whilst employing a closed, even proto-socialist economy. And this was seen as a threat, and as such, had to be brought down by nefarious powers. In fact, the War of the Triple Alliance actually had a clandestine participant swaying the conflict their way. a secret fourth ally, an insidious group with global reach, a people most nefarious, the British. Yeah, no. As you would have guessed by my incredulous tone, this narrative appears to be BS. What looks to have happened is that in the 70s and 80s, a revisionist history emerged. Spoilers, but this perspective is generally based on ideological grounds and circumstantial evidence. But to properly discuss this point, we first need to look at
The economics of 19th century Paraguay.
I swear it's mildly more interesting than it sounds. Look, in my mind, economic theory is needlessly complicated and makes my head hurt, so I'm going to do my best here to interpret what others have written on the topic, and at the end I'll jump in and tell you why I believe that the counter-revisionist argument is more substantial. So, as we saw earlier, Paraguay broke away from the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, who attempted to retake said territory. The Paraguayans, with heavy support from the landed and native Creole class, were able to eventually repel these attempts, forcing Buenos Aires to instead blockade the key river trade routes that the Paraguayan economy was reliant on. In 1814, is elected dictator, and he would begin to concentrate power. This would culminate in 1820, where the Creole landowners, unhappy with the power of Francia, would plot the so-called Grand Conspiracy to rid themselves of the dictator. This was discovered, and hundreds were arrested, and the land was confiscated by the government. This was the first of 4 major land nationalizations in the 1820s, which would see over 50% of Paraguayan territory being government-owned by the end of the decade. At this point, perspectives diverge. Richard Allen White portrays Francia's Paraguay as a bold egalitarian society. He frames the isolation from river trade by Buenos Aires as an intentional opportunity to turn inwards, beginning an experiment in self-sufficiency, rendering the state the only one in South America free from European interests. Moreover, he characterizes the nationalization of land as the redistribution of territory from the old elites in the church to smallholders, establishing a nationalized rent scheme, a peasant society, liberated from both external dependence and internal exploitation, a people's nation under a benevolent dictator. Similarly, Vera Blin-Reber, remember her name for later, would use a comprehensive study of yerba mate production as a basis to claim that the Francia regime was, quote, neither dictatorial nor monopolistic. So great, we've got a socialist utopia in the middle of the Paraguayan jungle. Now why does that sound familiar? Oh, you hear that? Yeah, sounds like the fucking fun police through the door. Here comes Mario Pastor, ready to shit on your notions of a glorious Paraguayan socialist experiment. Pastor utilizes what fiscal data from the time is available to characterize the Francia era as one of economic regression and political coercion. Here the lack of trade is not seen as some grand effort to create a self-sufficient autarchical society, but as a political gambit that justified confiscations and forced contributions. Pastor claims that the confiscation of property was not the redistribution of land to the working class, but rather served to displace the peasants from the territory they'd been previously freely working, and then forced them to lease the same plots. And whilst White argues that Francia dismantled the colonial process of coercive labour, liberating the lower classes, Pastor states that the coercion continued, with the state merely replacing private owners. The enterprise of slavery persisted, and Francia introduced conscription as part of its aforementioned militarization, with roughly 1 in every 6 to 8 working males associated with the military. These men were then utilized as labor on nationalized property. One last point is that of industrialization. White argues that certain state enterprises can be seen as being proto-industrialized, as domestic supply of manufactured products supplemented the lack of international imports due to the state's isolationism. This in turn supports the claim that Paraguay was not simply self-sufficient, but developing along alternate lines to the rest of the continent, creating an implication that the regime may be seen as a threat to the status quo. This argument, however, is, in my opinion, completely undermined by Pastor. He uses the available statistics to show that the state enterprises were small, ad hoc, and coercion-based, finding that, quote, the revisionist hypotheses on state-led industrialization in Paraguay must be rejected because they lack empirical support. If you have a long afternoon planned of watching paint dry but fear the exhilaration might be too much for your fragile little heart to handle, I put the paper where Pastor goes into great detail on the various individual works within the Paraguayan state in the description, alongside my other sources, if you really feel like checking it out. Right, let's do a cheeky little bit of historiography. Whilst White's work is far from the only revisionist source, it is the most general and wide-reaching one I can find in English, and as such, I'm using it to illustrate the general arguments of the revisionist camp. White portrays Paraguayan society pre-war as one of revolutionary vigour that was crushed by external powers before Francia's grand designs could be completed. However, he originally frames his arguments through the lens of dependency theory, and as such, views the Paraguayan government's actions through associated notions, which creates what I believe to be some dubious assumptions. Additionally, White is heavily reliant on traveller accounts, anecdotal evidence, and official government proclamations. Whilst this is not inherently a flaw, In this case, it reads a bit like a historian 200 years from now, concluding that North Korea is a great power because the glorious leader proclaimed that the rest of the world cowers before their military might. On the other hand, Pastor bases his findings mainly on archival budgets and registers and other official documentation. Notably, this does have the flaw of there being large gaps in the data because it's over 150 years old, which is of course a reason for concern. However, to me at least, his work reads as a more effective analysis of the economic situation at the period. Ultimately, as much as White can show pretty pictures of the noble Paraguayan slaying the vulture of imperialism, his work reads as one that came to a conclusion first, and then saw evidence to try and support it. So, was there a glorious Paraguayan socialist experiment in the 1850s that was a threat to the global world order? Probably not. And did the British intervene against the Paraguayans in order to crush the regime? Not really. Whilst the British did send financial aid to the Allies during the war, this was more due to them having business ventures in Brazil and Argentina, and them losing the war would thus be detrimental to their interests. The British had no real ideological interest in the conflict, outside of maybe some minor prejudices against the Paraguayan people. That's neither here nor there. If you want a fairly readable source that goes into more detail, I've linked Leslie Bethell's paper on the issue in the description. Christ, that was a long tangent. Where was I? Paraguay. This has just turned from an FPS into a survival horror. Okay, so when I said that, I might have been stretching the truth just a little bit. Across the war, Brazil would contribute a vast majority of the troops, leadership and equipment. Argentina would sprinkle a bit here and there, whilst Uruguay would only provide a token force and was mostly there for moral support. I'm not going to go into depth in the actual conflict. Plenty of other people have done that much better than I ever could, and God knows this video is already long enough, so I'll just try and give you guys the Cliff Notes version. What is neat to note is that a lot of novel technology was used, particularly on the Allied side, who made use of things like ironclads on the rivers, and balloon observation to help with navigation. Okay, so right off the bat, Paraguay launches an incursion to Brazilian Mato Grosso. But this would rapidly stagnate, and not much would happen here through the rest of the war, because, let's look at this on Google Maps, and... yeah. Hang on a second. Brazil, what the fuck? Right, Antonio. Enemy positions are just over there. Run up your men, supplies and weapons, and go get 'em, Tiger. However, one area the Paraguayans could not compete was on the naval front, and control of the strategically important river systems would be crucial for the war effort. Luckily, the command had a devious plan. Okay, Commodore Meze. Brazilian Navy's at anchor. In the dead of night, take your men, board the boats while the sailors are on shore, and bring them back. Or just like that? Sure, don't see why not. Okay.
Food.
The Battle of Riachuelo would see Paraguay lose basically their whole naval force, and from there, Brazil would effectively blockade the country for the rest of the war. On the southern front, the Paraguayan army, which likely enjoyed a force-size advantage compared to the Allies at this point, though this would rapidly change, would launch an incursion across Argentinian Misiones and into Rio Grande do Sul. They would never reach their Uruguayan allies, however, and their advance would be halted before their eventual surrender on the 14th of September 1865 in the town of Uruguaiana, which is in Brazil, because of course it is. From here, the Allies would go on the offensive. In April 1866, they would set up HQ in the marshlands of Tuiuti in the northern corner of the mainland of Paraguay. Here would be the site of the famous and decisive Battle of Tuiuti, sometimes described as the bloodiest battle in South American history, where the fearsome Paraguayan cavalry would charge and be repulsed by Allied defenders, breaking the back of the aggressor's army. While sources conflict on the total casualties, a conservative estimate finds that of roughly 25,000 Paraguayan soldiers on the field of battle, 1 in 5 were killed, and more than that number again were captured, wounded, or missing. This would be the last major Paraguayan attack of the war. However, it would take another 3 months before the Allies would continue their advance. Why? Well, the best and really only method of advancing into the heartland was along the rivers, because, middle of the jungle and all that. This was obvious to everyone, and so as part of the massive portion of the Paraguayan economy that was committed to the military pre-war, a series of forts were constructed at strategic points along the Parana and Paraguay rivers. These would prove a total pain in the ass for Allied planners. Also, at around this point, Paraguayan dictator Lopez met with Allied Commander-in-Chief Mitre in secret, with Lopez offering territorial concessions to bring the war to a swift conclusion, so long as his regime could persist. However, likely in part due to the fact that the Allied governments at home had betrayed the war of one of the forces of liberalism and democracy, triumphing over the backwards autocratic Paraguayans, the offer was refused. Let's just ignore the fact that Brazil held these positions despite only outlawing slavery in 1888, which was in large part spurred on by the war. Long story. However, 10 days later, on the 22nd, the Allies would suffer a humiliating defeat, as a miscalculated offensive saw the Allied forces attacking entrenched Paraguayan positions around the naval fort at Hurtado, with the Allies suffering somewhere in the region of 50 times the number of casualties compared to the defenders. This would see internal strife within the Triple Alliance, and the halt of more offensive action for the next 10 months. Said new offensive would culminate in the victory at the year-long siege of Humatia. Like I said before, not going to go into too much detail, but the defense of the so-called Gibraltar of South America, or Paraguay Sevastopol, which blocked the crucial river access routes into Asuncion, basically exhausted the Paraguayan war effort. Yet, as a testament to the will and tenacity of the Paraguayan people to fight, even after their army was practically obliterated, it would still take until the beginning of 1869 for the Allies to enter the Paraguayan capital. But Lopez didn't hear no fucking bell. Whilst the rest of the nation was coming under Allied occupation, he'd retreat west and stage limited guerrilla actions using whatever manpower he could find. This desperation is illustrated by the fact that the battle that would see his eventual defeat is colloquially referred to as the Children's Battle. This would be the final engagement of the war, with many historians claiming the conflict ended when a bullet ripped through the dictator's chest. His last words were reportedly, "Muero con mi patria. I die for my nation." Alright, we made it. And now, since you've all been such good little homunculi, we get to talk about the funny dead people number. As I'm sure many of you would have heard, the off-reported casualty figure for the Paraguayan side saw the nation losing 90% of its adult male population. But this doesn't seem to be quite right. So what was the actual number of Paraguayan casualties? Well, it's complicated. Or at least that's what they want you to believe. No, not doing this bit again. Not happening, not again. So basically what happened is the first major source I found was from our old friend Vera Berlin-Reber. You might remember as one of the revisionist historians from earlier. And, hand on my heart, gonna be honest with you guys, this text really spoke to me, as I'd kind of come into this research with the preconceived notion that the often reported figures were way over-exaggerated. And this paper supported that idea. I know, bad history and all, but come on, 90% of the male population is just wild. Anyway, Reber suggested to me
8 to 18%
of the total population was killed during the war, far from the commonly quoted 40 to 50+% figure. So great, sensationalization and Chinese whispers have served to greatly exaggerate a historical footnote. But I did have some reservations about Reber's work, and as a matter of fact, so did Thomas Whigham and Barbara Potast in their paper, some strong reservations. Look, I can't really be bothered to dissect both papers for you, but the gist is that Reber almost certainly utilised the pre-war birth rate that was a fair way off in her calculations. Further, her data about the late years of the war doesn't seem to line up. The latter paper is also by no means perfect. In my mind, it at times relies too heavily on reasoning its way to a conclusion without sufficient evidence, but overall it works as a solid rebuttal to Reber. It would also be remiss of me not to mention that a later paper by our dynamic duo utilises an 1870 census as evidence for a national casualty rate as high as 69%. However, this data was likely flawed, as it would fail to take into account those who fled the nation and later returned, as well as the fact that collecting data in a nation that's just gone through, well, an all-encompassing war is notoriously difficult. But we still don't really have any definitive number that you can point to, so you can be a pain in the ass and irritatingly correct anyone who brings up the 90% figure. So I guess there's no real way around it. It's time for a bit of math. That was done all by me with no outside help. For starters, we're going to need some base population numbers, which is surprisingly difficult. For example, here's a list of just some of the reported populations of Paraguay from various sources. For our purposes, we're going to treat these 4 key censuses as definitively correct, as literature tends to read them as such, and I see no reason to contradict this. Are they spot on? Almost certainly not, but we're going to need some numbers to work with, so yeah.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Just one issue. Second census is here, third is here, and the war is here. So it's time to go into the wacky world of population growth. So in 1846, there's like 238,000 people in Paraguay, and by 1886, the number is more like 329,000. But that number is much lower than would be expected. To find said expected number, we of course need a rough year-on-year population growth figure for Paraguay. Earlier, Rob suggested a 1.5% figure, however a more realistic number that better reflects what documentation we do have, as well as being within a similar-ish range to other LATAM nations during the period, would be somewhere around 1.75 to 2-ish%. From here, using these numbers, we need to find what population we'd expect to find in 1870 at the end of the war, and then compare that to a best estimation of the actual figure. Here we go. So we find that there's somewhere between 360,000
and 385,000
Paraguayans if there is no war in 1870. We then need a post-war population growth rate to get us up to 1886. Reber finds that a number between 1.8 and 2.2% is apt, and in my not at all professional opinion, I don't see any reason to disagree. We then calculate the differences to work out the total casualty percentages for Paraguay, and shit. The calculations show that Paraguay lost somewhere between 30 and 40% of its pre-war population over just a 6-year period, which is just fucking nuts. Imagine, like, 100 million Americans just gone over 6 years. Obviously not a perfect comparison, but the ratios do line up more or less. Now for the percentage of the adult male population gone. Is it the 90%? Well, in this context, we're talking about fighting age males, which for this war is roughly 12 to 60-year-olds. We've got some documents that found that there were 11,081 draft-age males left by the end of the war, but this obviously doesn't account for those who fled, were in hiding, or otherwise missing. So we'll go with a fairly arbitrary, but in my mind reasonable number of 20,000 plus minus 5,000. The same paper found that without military conflict, the country should have had about 120,000 military-aged men at the time of the end of the war. But this is based on an extrapolation of figures only from the more populated half of the country, so the real number is likely lower. We'll say 100,000. Is this good history? Not really, but anyways. Using these very dodgy numbers, we would suggest that of the roughly 35% of the population lost, this included almost 80% of the adult male population. So, yeah. That's the number. 80%. Shit. The whole 90% misconception isn't actually that far off. But, take a moment to consider that. You go to war, and realistically, you and 3 other members of that one 5-person group shot aren't making it back. In this context, the Backstreet Boys become the Backstreet Boy, the Incredibles become the Incredible, and the Guardians of the Galaxy just a tree. But on the upside, if you are a surviving bloke, well, you know what that means. 500% of your income being garnished for child support. So, yeah, there you go. I guess I could go on about how this war impacted the social cultural framework of the nation, or how it modeled later events like the Chicao War and 1936 Revolution, but fuck me, this video is already long enough, isn't it? I guess if we do need some kind of broad moral conclusion to wrap this whole thing up with, well, twice when I was researching this video, I came across someone shouting at the top of their lungs that the established historical canon was BS, and that they have the actual truth, only for a closer investigation to reveal that the established narrative was pretty close to what looks to be accurate. So, I guess just because someone is shouting at the top of their lungs that everyone else is wrong, doesn't inherently mean they're right. Anyway guys, cheers for watching.